I've been working at the KFC in my town for a few years now, always on the night shift. Anyone who works in a restaurant knows how it is. After a certain hour, business almost stops, and the place is practically empty. It was one of those normal nights, with a lot of rain outside. I was finishing up the cleaning in the kitchen, like I always do before closing. The security guard was already out front, waiting for closing time, while I washed the last of the dishes. The rain was heavy, hitting hard against the windows and making that constant noise that almost makes you sleepy. Normally, I find it relaxing, but that night it felt different, like the sound was distracting me from something. While I was washing the dishes, I started to get a strange feeling, the kind you get when you know something's wrong, but you don't know what. That's when, instinctively, I looked out the kitchen window and saw a man standing across the street. I couldn't see his face clearly because of the rain and the dim light, but he was clearly looking in the direction of the restaurant. I thought it was a bit strange because it was late, and the security guard should have been the only person outside. For a second, I thought maybe he was a homeless person looking for shelter, or just someone waiting for the rain to pass. I tried to get back to my work, but the feeling that something was off wouldn't leave me. My eyes kept going back to the window, to see if he was still there. And he was still there, standing still. He wasn't moving. That made me a little uneasy, but I tried to ignore it, thinking I was overreacting. I even thought about calling the security guard, but I figured he'd think I was being silly, you know? So I kept washing the dishes, trying to focus. Then, out of nowhere, he started to move. First slowly, like he had decided to come toward the restaurant. Then he started crossing the street, directly toward the kitchen window where I was. At that moment, I felt my heart race. I watched him get closer and tried to figure out what he wanted. The rain made everything look kind of distorted, but I could see he was coming straight for me. He got up to the window and started saying something. I couldn't hear him because of the rain pounding on the glass. I could only see his lips moving, and I could tell he was trying to say something important. I waved, trying to show I couldn't hear, and pointed to the front of the restaurant where the security guard was. I gestured for him to go there, like, if you need something, talk to the security guard. But he didn't move, just stayed there, pressed against the glass, still trying to say something. That gave me a bad feeling. I knew I shouldn't open the window, so I didn't. The rain kept coming down hard, and I could only see his face, blurred by the raindrops. He started to get impatient. Suddenly, he began pulling at the window, trying to force it open. The noise of it all, the rain and the window being yanked, terrified me. Without thinking twice, I dropped the dishes and ran to the front of the restaurant, yelling for the security guard. When I got there, I tried to explain as quickly as I could what was happening. The guard looked at me, a bit confused, but he realized I was really scared. He grabbed his flashlight and told me to wait there while he went to check it out. I went back with him to the kitchen, my heart racing. I expected to see the man still there, trying to open the window, but when we got there was no one. The window was shut, like nothing had happened. I looked around, searching for any sign that he'd been there, but I saw nothing unusual. The rain was still pouring, but the man had simply vanished. The guard looked out the window, trying to see if he was nearby, but the street was completely empty. He asked me if I was sure about what I'd seen, and I insisted I was, that the man was there, trying to open the window. He gave me a skeptical look, like he thought I might be overreacting, but said he'd do a patrol around the building just to make sure. I stayed in the kitchen trying to process what had just happened. I couldn't believe he had disappeared so quickly. The sound of the rain seemed even louder now, almost deafening. I kept looking out the window, hoping to see him again, but there was nothing. Just the rain and the darkness outside. After a few minutes, the security guard came back, saying he hadn't found anything. He suggested maybe I was tired or had imagined it, but I knew what I'd seen. The face of that man standing in the rain, staring straight at me, wouldn't leave my mind. I felt like it wasn't over, that he was still out there somehow. I tried to get back to work, but my hands were shaking and I couldn't focus. Every sound, every little noise made me look at the window, expecting to see him again. The feeling that something was very wrong wouldn't leave me. I just wanted the night to end soon, but deep down, I knew that even when it was over, I'd never forget what had happened. And that's how that part of the night ended, with me still trying to understand what I'd seen. Was there really someone out there, or was I losing my mind? I know what I saw, but nothing made sense. And after that night, looking out the kitchen window was never the same again. It was a quiet night. I was on my security shift, which started around 11 p.m. and went until the next morning. The restaurant was practically empty, except for the security cameras I had to monitor and a few routine checks. Normally, these shifts are pretty boring, with not much to do besides making sure nothing is out of place and everything is secure. But that night, something changed. Around 3 a.m., I was sitting in the control room, where the monitors show all the cameras in the restaurant. The only light came from the screens, and the rest of the restaurant was shrouded in shadows. It was about halfway through my shift, and I was starting to feel the monotony of the night. Suddenly, I heard a metallic noise from one of the areas of the restaurant. It sounded like something had broken with force. I immediately got up from my chair, my heart racing. The sound had come from the back of the restaurant near the kitchen. I grabbed my gun, as usual when something suspicious happens, and started heading toward the noise. The restaurant was silent. The cold of the early morning and the heavy air added to the tense atmosphere. As I walked down the dark hallways, I couldn't get the sharp sound of breaking glass out of my head. The feeling that something was wrong seemed to grow with every second. I reached the kitchen and found what seemed to be the source of the noise. A large piece of glass was scattered across the floor. I looked around and realized that the broken glass was part of one of the refrigerator doors. Not something I would expect to find on a normal night. The place was a mess. There were pieces of glass everywhere, and I had to be careful not to hurt myself while investigating. What really caught my attention were the footprints on the floor. They were large and uneven, as if someone had walked barefoot there. The footprints were dirty, and I could see traces of dirt and mud mixed with what looked like a bit of grease. I couldn't understand why someone would be barefoot in a place like this, especially in the middle of the night. I followed the footprints to the refrigerator, and what I saw was even more disturbing. The refrigerator doors were open, and the inside was a mess. Some canned goods and other items were out of place, and I noticed that some things were missing. It was clear that someone had gone in there and taken a few things. Everything seemed to be in disarray, as if the person was looking for something specific or just grabbing whatever they could. The impression I had was that the intruder was someone desperate. The bare footprints and the way the refrigerator had been ransacked suggested that the intruder didn't have a fixed place to stay. Maybe it was a homeless person looking for something to eat. The thought that someone was struggling and chose the KFC as their target made me uneasy. But what really disturbed me was the fact that no one had been captured by the security cameras. The footage was all normal, with no signs of suspicious movements, which didn't make sense given the chaos I was seeing. Hearing the noise and seeing the footprints, I knew I needed to take some action. I called the police and explained the situation. While waiting for the patrol to arrive, I continued to inspect the restaurant. The feeling of being alone in that empty and disordered environment was strange. I felt like I was in a suspense movie. The idea that the intruder could still be nearby made me nervous. When the police arrived, they searched the restaurant and the surrounding area, but they didn't find anyone. They also checked the security cameras, but there was nothing unusual in the footage. Everything seemed normal, which only added to the mystery. But there wasn't much solid evidence to go on. As the police finished their investigation, I wondered what had driven that intruder to do what he did. The idea of someone grabbing canned goods and rummaging through a refrigerator seemed as surreal as it was unsettling. What was he looking for? Was there something more behind this break-in? The thought that he might come back or that there might be something more involved wouldn't leave my mind. And so, with the restaurant now quiet and the police having left, I continued to wonder about what really happened that night. The dirty footprints, the broken glass, and the missing canned goods were the only proof that something strange had happened, but the mystery of who the intruder was and why he was there still troubled me. The feeling that something was still unresolved hung in the air, and I couldn't stop wondering if this was just the beginning of something bigger. I hope you enjoyed this story, and if anyone has any ideas or has gone through something similar, I'd love to hear from you. Until next time. I'm 26 years old and I live in Springfield, Missouri. I've been working at the KFC here in town for about 3 years. I never thought I'd have a story like this to tell, but after what happened, I felt like I had to share it. I don't know if anyone will believe me, but maybe this will help someone be more careful, you know? Well, I'll start from the beginning, because I'm still trying to make sense of it all. It was a Tuesday, just one of those really normal days, nothing special. I was working my night shift, which wasn't anything new for me. Here in Springfield, things tend to be pretty quiet, especially at night. Most people are at home, resting, and the traffic at KFC is slower. Usually, I spend most of my time cleaning tables, checking inventory, and sometimes even watching something on the TV we have in the corner just to pass the time. That night, around 9, a guy came in who I had never seen before. And you know, around here, you kind of get to know everyone by sight, at least. He was tall, probably in his 40s, wearing a really worn-out jacket and a cap that covered part of his face. Nothing too unusual, but at the same time, there was something about him that just didn't seem to fit, you know? Maybe it was the way he looked around, like he was checking the place out. But at the moment, I just thought he was new in town or just passing through. He walked straight up to the counter without saying a word and stared at the menu for a few seconds. I was waiting for him to order something, but he didn't say anything, just looked. After a bit, he finally ordered a bucket of chicken and some fries. Everything seemed normal. He paid in cash, which, by the way, was kind of crumpled and dirty, like it had been kept somewhere weird. But again, I didn't think much of it. You see all kinds of things working in fast food, so these things just sort of slide by. He took his order, gave a slight nod, and left. No big deal, right? But as soon as he walked out, I felt a weird shiver. It wasn't exactly fear, but a strange feeling, like something wasn't right. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to figure out what had made me feel like that, but I ended up convincing myself that it was just fatigue. After all, it had been a long day, and I was counting down the minutes until I could go home. As I wiped down the counter, I kept turning around to look at the door and the windows, but I didn't see anything. Springfield is a small and quiet town, so this feeling of paranoia was pretty uncommon for me. But anyway, I kept doing my tasks, trying to ignore that discomfort. The night went on, and around 10:30, the crowd had died down a lot. The few customers who had come in were already leaving, and I started closing the register and getting everything ready to end the shift. That's when I noticed the door to the KFC opened again. I looked up, and to my surprise, it was the same guy from before. Only this time, he looked different. More tense, maybe? He stood at the entrance for a few seconds, just looking around, and then slowly he started walking toward me. When he got to the counter, he didn't say anything. He just stood there staring at me. So, trying not to look nervous, I asked if he wanted to order something else. He smiled, but it was a weird smile, like he knew something I didn't. He opened his mouth to speak, but what came out was a whisper. I couldn't understand what he said. It seemed like he was talking to himself, and that made me even more uncomfortable. That's when I felt a real chill run down my spine. Something in the air changed, like it had gotten heavier. I was starting to panic on the inside, but I kept my calm, or at least tried to. I asked again if he wanted to make an order, but he just kept smiling that strange smile. Then he reached into his jacket and I froze. My first reaction was to think he was going to pull out a gun, and my heart started pounding hard. But instead, he took out a small cloth bag, which looked really old and worn out, and placed it on the counter in front of me. I looked at him confused, and he just said, "Open it." My hands were shaking, but I did what he asked. When I opened the bag, I saw it was filled with dollar bills, but they were old, dirty, like the kind you find buried or stashed away in some forgotten place. He then looked right into my eyes and said in a low voice, "Put all the money from the register in here." I was completely paralyzed. My brain was trying to process what was happening, but it felt like everything around me had slowed down. I knew I needed to do something, but I couldn't think of anything other than what he had just said. Fear took over me, and without questioning, I started taking the money out of the register and putting it into his bag. As I did that, I started noticing details I hadn't before. The security cameras, which should have been on, were off. This only increased my panic. How hadn't I seen that before? It was like everything had been planned, but I couldn't understand how or why. The man remained silent the entire time, just watching while I put the money in the bag. After I finished, he took the bag, turned around, and started to leave. But before he walked out the door, he stopped, looked over his shoulder at me, and said, "Thank you, I'm just here to do the best I can." I couldn't respond. I just stood there, staring as he walked out. The sound of the door closing was like a snap that brought me back to reality. What had just happened? And that's how that night ended. By the time the police arrived, the man had already escaped, so there wasn't much they could do, nothing worth mentioning here. I should have been relieved that he had left without hurting anyone, but instead, I was left with the feeling that this wasn't really over. When the police arrived, there wasn't much they could do, considering the cameras hadn't captured anything. I just gave my statement, provided a description of the man, and that was that. That night, when I got home, I set my feet on the ground to thank God for getting me out of that mess unharmed.